I have locked myself away in a little cabin in a little beach house at Scarborough, and I'm busy putting together the concept for a film, and all the little bits and pieces are shot here in the backyard just to piece together everything that I've been feeling, watching, and understanding, and piecing all the puzzle pieces together to kind of make one coherent picture. As I'm sure you're well aware of by now, humanity is entering a vastly different future. I'm making a video series about a growing subculture of people who believe that human evolution is on the brink of an epochal shift.
We are smack dab in the middle of a global scale, civilization level collapse.
The world built on top of our defining mythology falls apart.
Many of us feel that the current leadership cannot make sense of what is going on. I'm going to showcase an emergent group of thought leaders who are pointing towards a massive societal step up.
The systems and complexity people saw it first because they were actually looking at how all these different fragilities across different systems were providing a perfect storm. It was coming, and it happened to be a pandemic.
It's something that is being really highlighted with what's happening right now, because we've had what initially started as a medical crisis cascading into an economic crisis, which is having knock-on effects in the education system and all of these other systems. So what it's doing is really showing, I think, giving people a very visceral, direct experience of what a lot of systems thinkers and complexity theorists have been talking about for a very long time.
That finally a still small but growing number of people have started to realize that the epoch that we're in, the status quo, game A, whatever we want to call it, is coming to an end.
The end of the world as we know it doesn't have to be a bad thing.
How this sort of idea about alternative operating systems seems to be coming into a sharp relief for a lot of people.
It's more like a shift from single cell to multicellular life. It's like a really deep fundamental shift in the level and type of complexity in the nature of reality that we're talking about.
How change happens through crisis, even through a process of initiation where the old normal falls apart, where we recognize finally that reality is not what we had thought it to be, and that therefore we ourselves are not who we thought ourselves to be.
As the implications of the COVID pandemic come to light, I think it is vital that we participate in creating a more beautiful world, in contrast to the dystopian views portrayed by so much of the media. Join me as I take you on a journey of sense-making and connecting the dots of what could potentially be the maturing of an adolescent society and the emergence of a consciously created future that not only sustains, but that can actually thrive.
Saying that would be like my only hope for a kind of glorious revolution versus a bloody reign of terror. If we can simply, if the people and the ideas and then the actions can just do an end run around the established balances of power, and again,
it would be that. Like, we've got the tools, now we have to use them, and there's not a moment to spare.
There is a silver lining in it as well, which is that I've really noticed a lot of people saying that they feel like they're being called to step up in some way.
So there are going to be two parts to this film. The first part is a recontextualization, a reframing of the issues that we have in the world. If we take a much larger context, we'll see that the solutions are provided for when we just change the context of what the problem is. So we're going to zoom right out and have a look at the evolution of mankind and the evolution of the individual and recontextualize the problem to see the solutions. And the second part is called regenerate, and that is a process of rebuilding a self-identity and rebuilding communities and rebuilding the structures in which humanity operates that are in alignment with a thriving planet, something that is within the carrying capacity of the planet, but then also a much better game plan that we have with one another.
So my actual intention with the documentary is to create a group of creatives, a group of people able to help me create incubators that help people make transition and make a personal transformation, and also help build maps and blueprints of the alternative systems of money, decision-making, collective intelligence, education, and skills training to help build this new world of possibilities.
So I'm going to say that to me, I think it's obvious that humanity has been on an unsustainable, or rather should we say, a self-terminating trajectory. And our current leadership and our way of systems are set up that makes change almost impossible.
But at some point, we need this interruption to say, hold on here. Is this working? Have we actually hit bottom? Like, this is showing us where bottom is going to be, like what current trends are taking us toward. And that's why I have hope in this crisis, as well as a certain amount of despair and despondency. Before we started recording, you asked me, how am I doing? And like sometimes I'm like, oh my God, everything that I've been afraid of is happening now. And I see this timeline going into a dystopian future where it becomes normal never to leave your house. Like now, our civilization is just like, like I said, like this rope that's pulled tighter and tighter and tighter until it just takes a little touch for it to snap. And if it wasn't going to be this, it was going to be something else. So now we're in it. And from the totalitarian nightmare of constant surveillance to the nightmare of separation from each other, like all of these things are happening. And so sometimes I'm like, I go through this despondency, but it helps me to recognize that this is also, it's a choice point, making our old trajectory visible, conscious, and therefore we could still choose to go that way, but maybe there's an awareness now that we do have a choice.
Recognize that we're operating the same way that has always led to war and environmental destruction and collapse of civilization, just factoring exponential technology. And so when you start to think about exponential rivalrous dynamics that lead to polarization that ends up leading to war, but now exponential warfare, it becomes larger than a finite biosphere can handle, and it becomes existential. When you think about exponential extraction and exponential pollution, which means depletion and accumulation from open loops in a network diagram. You go to an ecosystem, there are no open loops. Everything is the food for something else. There is no unrenewable resource, no waste. Our civilization is characterized by a materials economy that's linear, not circular. So toxicity is depletion on one side, accumulation on the other. Whether we're talking about on the depletion side, whether we're talking about species extinction or biodiversity loss or any of the issues that we look at there, and on the accumulation side, whether we're talking about CO2 levels in the air or in the water or nitrogen runoff or degraded uranium or whatever else it is, those are all specific instantiations of open loops in the way we do civilization in relationship to the closed loop dynamics of the ecosystem that both have a civilization that is increasingly fragile and that is making an increasingly fragile underlying ecosystem. It is basically debasing the substrate upon which it depends. And so when you think about exponential extraction, exponential pollution, that obviously gets larger than the playing field can handle. When you try and think about exponential expansion of the monetary supply that has to be based in goods and services, that can't keep happening. When you think about we compete using narrative and information, when you start to think about exponential information tech used for disinformation and for population control, you get to a place where the information ecology is so broken that what's actually happening with North Korea or not? Are we going to have nuclear war? What's actually happening with Syria? What's actually happening with Putin's relationship to the Trump administration? How long do we really have before all the coral die off? Like all the most important questions as to whether we make it or not as a species, nobody really knows how to make sense of. And so when you have a situation where you've actually got an exponentially decreasing sense-making capacity, right? An information ecology that is increasingly more broken, with an exponentially increasing capacity to make big choices, right? Technology is basically a lever of our choice making. So a fist has one level of harm. When I extend that to a stone tool, it's a bigger harm. To a bronze tool, to a gun, at the level of an ICBM, there's just a really big extension of that type of choice making capacity. But when I have exponentially increased choice making capacity with exponentially worse sense making, that always runs into a cliff. And so the underlying dynamics that are leading to the self-termination that people feel and sense right now are not different in kind than the ones that we've been facing since the beginning of what we call civilization. They're different in magnitude and in the speed of process, factoring the exponential curves involved.
It makes plenty of sense that when there was just so much low-hanging fruit in terms of coal and oil and fish and trees and et cetera, that we would do this exponential boom kind of thing. It's just that's not viable anymore. It also happens to be that the technologies that would allow us to be really viable in a post-growth economic system, it's not about net more consumption, but about using the same things in a closed-loop materials economy in ever more interesting ways. So a materials economy that is closed-loop, post-growth, and upcycling, continuously upcycling. The technology it takes to do that is technology we are just now getting. Happens to be that that's at the same time that we are just now getting to the point of self-termination of the old system, right? So we both have to shift and can at the same time. The technologies it takes to build this kind of sustainable, regenerative, thriving, new set of world systems is technology that we developed via capitalism and linear materials economy and the military-industrial complex and all those things. So they served an evolutionary relevance in terms of where we're going, and they have just completed a particular evolutionary relevant life cycle. And now we're going through a discrete phase shift into a new life cycle, very much like a fetal time period, right? An embryonic time period is unsustainable. The caterpillar can't just keep devastating its ecosystem without pollinating forever, but that's not how it works. And a baby couldn't stay in the belly after 40 weeks and act parasitically, but that's not how it works. It is going through a period where its system is fundamentally not capable of the kinds of autonomy that it will later be capable of. So it's a finite evolutionary period of unsustainable development to then go through a discrete phase shift to then be in a fundamentally new period. And so I think it's a very fair analogy to look at humanity as having been in a kind of embryonic period. Bucky Fuller used to like to speak to it like that, like a chicken embryo having finished eating the egg white, unrenewable resources, emerge from a world it didn't know it was in, right? Emerge from the shell into a world where that it now has a beak to eat that it didn't have before when it was eating the egg whites, come from plants that its poop fertilizes, and it's part of this larger kind of regenerative process that evolved. So
what we have to do is a big structural political economic stuff. What we're being told to do is change your cotton buds and all these sort of pathetic micro-consumerist bollocks, which just isn't going to get us anywhere.
Our interrelated systems of money and decision-making and politics and healthcare and education are not going to serve us going forward. So I think we are at the point where we need to re-architect a new playing field, one that is not just sustainable, but one that allows life and humanity to thrive.
And what is, because some people talk about the shift being, we can talk about it in terms of material terms, or we can talk about it in terms of an evolution in consciousness or the way that we operate. What do you sense is that leap that we need to make in terms of how we operate?
You actually have to think about it on all of those levels to be able to make sense of it in a meaningful way. Otherwise, it's kind of like asking, when we are talking about the health of a person, whether that means the health of their liver or their kidneys or their blood, it's like that doesn't even make sense. You can't separate those things from each other. So when I think about what economics is our value system codified as value equations that determines how much we value one thing relative to another thing, that determines what we're incentivized to do and what we confer power to. So if a dead whale is worth $1 million on a fishing boat and a live whale in the ocean is worth nothing, that's a value system codified in a value equation that then incentivizes behavior, but it also incentivizes psychopathology, right? Psychopathy, actually. I have to shut empathy down because leaving the whale in the ocean, it actually isn't even going to stay in the ocean. Another guy's going to hunt it out, right? So I've got a tragedy of the common, so I have to kind of deaden to be able to do the thing that is incentivized by the system. Or somebody else does and I'm just not effective in the system. So you can't think about the evolution of human consciousness and the evolution of economics differently. If you look at the way economics then needs to protect its own profit stream and the way it will learn how to influence media to control people's sense-making frameworks and the way it will influence governance, again, this is getting to consciousness, or the way it will influence legislation on the nature of what happens in education to prepare people for the workforce. And so the paradigm shift is basically everything. We need new systems of governance. If we just, we think about how much we love the word democracy. And we love the word democracy because it's better than tyranny. And it's better than the other really horrible systems that we've experienced at any scale. But when Winston Churchill said democracy is the single worst form of governance ever created, save for all the other forms, what he was saying that was really insightful was that getting lots of humans to agree on anything is just a hard thing to do and we suck at it. And we've never actually done a good job at it. And this is a really flawed system. Now, we like it because, like we said, it's overcoming things that were even more problematic. But if you think about democracy for a moment, and whether we're talking representative democracy or liquid democracy using a voting currency or binary vote, fundamentally you have a process of saying, okay, we can't get everybody to agree beyond a very small number of people. Dunbar number, tribe, you can get everybody to agree because they can all be in a conversation together. Beyond the level at which you can have a conversation together, you can have a few people control everything and they can be in a conversation together, some type of oligarchy or meritocracy. But then you're like, no, we want most of the people to agree at least, right? That seems like a good idea. But somebody puts forward a proposition to do something that they think is important based on their limited sense-making that is never everything. That proposition, because it wasn't informed by comprehensive sense-making, will always, in the process of benefiting something, also damage something else. And so some people love it based on if what it's benefiting is directly relevant to them, and other people hate it based on if what it's damaging is relevant to them. You just created inexorable polarization because you made shitty propositions and then asked people to vote yes or no binary on a shitty proposition. So you notice people actually don't all get to contribute to the sense-making of what a good proposition would be. There's no kind of collective input there. There isn't even a generation of what would good mean here. And so really, even their choice making is just yes or no on a frame that was already controlled. And typically, who's going to be able to even put forward a proposition is someone who has vested interests. And so you're stuck with polarization in that particular system, right? So we need new systems of governance that are not any system of governance the world has ever done so far. They are systems of how do we individually and collectively make sense of what's going on, make sense of what we actually value, and how those values can be synergistically satisfied rather than in a theory of trade-offs with each other, progressively better, and how do we create design that are optimal synergistic satisfiers. So that's a totally new thing, governance-wise. We need totally new systems of economics, we need totally new systems of education, healthcare, all the way down to, at an individual level, a new basis for identity, values, our own individual sense-making, choice-making. As long as I think that I'm an individual that is fundamentally separate from you and the biosphere and everything else, I can think about optimizing my own quality of life independent of and maybe even at the expense of your quality of life or the biosphere or anything else. As soon as I get that, I start to say, okay, well, I'm not that tree, but what would I be without trees? Well, I would not exist, right? Well, there would be no atmosphere if there weren't plants photosynthesizing. So I fundamentally am not even a meaningful concept without plants. So if I think of myself as me, that is not fundamentally interdependent with plants, I'm actually just not even thinking clearly, right? It's just a bad ontology. It's a bad semiotics. And then I start to run that and say, well, what about soil microbiota? And what about, and it turns out that my life depends on the whole thing. Right? So I can be better thought of as an emergent property of this whole thing, right? Not just the biosphere, because what would it be without the sun? And so as long as I have a sense of I that is separate and maybe even rivalrous competition for some scarce status, resource, attention, partner, whatever it is, then we have a fundamental basis for war. And in a world of exponentially increasing technology, which means that the warfare gets to be more and more consequential, that will self-terminate. So rivalrous dynamics multiplied by exponential tech self-terminate. Exponential tech is inexorable. We cannot put it away. So we either figure out anti-rivalry or we go extinct. The human experiment comes to a completion. That's the core thing.
Our opportunity right now is to have an evolutionary transition to the scale of the Earth's biosphere. So basically that humans build the technical apparatus and the management systems to maintain a kind of homeostasis on Earth, which is what we mean when we talk about sustainability. And so I think of us as really having a limited window of time where we can set in motion that trajectory.
If we can transition to this kind of system that Joe's talking about, where we take what we've learned over this 200-year great leap forward and then make another great leap forward, which is to intentionally embed humanity within the carrying capacity of the Earth.
So what really does make sense? If our current systems and worldview is breaking down, I think it is then up to us to insert something better before a top-down solution becomes enforced upon us.
Utopian, as one has previously thought of a perfected system, we're going to think of a protopian process, right? A process of emergence into more elegantly ordered complexity that has more and more emergent properties and more of the things we're interested in and gets over some of the underlying causes of things that we want to get past. I would say that rather than just iterative evolution, we are on the brink of a phase shift. And phase shift defined by core axioms and core foundations of most of our macro global systems, from our worldview to our economics, to our governance, to our infrastructure, going through foundational shifts. So this looks like a step function in evolution, where we have had capitalism that has gone through kind of iterative developmental processes, and we've had representative democracy that's gone through iterative developmental processes, and scientific methodology and worldview and et cetera. Now we are on the brink of something that requires larger, more fundamental, axiomatic and structural shift. And so we can talk about what the criteria for the other side of that have to look like for it to be a non-self-terminating system and for it to be a anti-fragile system. And those are two of the important criteria of any kind of world that is interesting for anyone, right? It is definitely non-self-terminating and then not anti-fragile.
Then what's wrong with our current system and why do we need to transition out of it?
So when we say our current system, we are sweeping a lot of things together, and it's worth kind of pulling those apart a bit. We might be talking about macroeconomics, which obviously the macroeconomics of China and the macroeconomics of Russia, the macroeconomics of the United States, of NATO are different systems. But there are kind of beyond national, global economic systems that we can look at. We can look at governance systems, again, national and then transnational governance, and then beyond anything that's codified, how human decision-making works, right? We can think of governance in the highest sense of how do we do collective decision-making at various scales, from a business to a family to a nation to groups of nations to a species as a whole, navigating things that face the whole species. Economics, we can think about how do we do resource allocation and how do we do human incentive systems. With infrastructure, we can talk about how do we meet our physical needs in relationship with the physical planet, right? Education, medicine. So we have a lot of different systems that co-evolved and they are interconnected and inter-influencing. And then you can think of a, kind of evolving paradigm that involves all of those things, but we're going to need to talk about at least the core ones in distinction from each other.
On the other hand, I don't see why we can't see that this collapse of our society and of our world is actually a good thing. It wasn't sustainable, and it didn't particularly feel very good for those that weren't in positions of power, who fed on these overextended senses of self through money and power. I think for most of us, there is actually an enormous relief that the collapse is here and that now we can actually build something much more legitimate and true to ourselves and also true to the nature and biosphere. So I actually think that this collapse and this time that we're in is really exciting. I think we can do it. I think that, well, it's not just I think we can do it. I feel in the spirit of humanity, I know that we can do the most amazing things, and this is it is more of a relief than it is a problem if we see it as such. So to try and wrap up the sense making and move on to how we actually implement change, it's got to make sense that the world that we've known, the way that we've been doing things, the rivalrous dynamics, the competition, all in the same fish tank, is no longer possible to continue. So it is actually that we are fundamentally needing to change our minds about how things work. And that is the real evolutionary shift. It's actually a shift of consciousness, an awareness shift, a moving from this level of complexity to a higher level order of complexity. And those game plans are like moving from a mechanistic machine.
So rather than the slow evolution of a parasite to be less pathologic, we need to do the actually going through a birth into a new phase model. And we can. What's so fascinating is that if we define a civilization where we have a sustainable population that does not require imposition from the outside, some kind of eugenics program or Chinese birth limiting program, whatever, it is a emergent self-organizing phenomena. And we've already seen plenty of places in the world where when education gets high enough, economics and female empowerment and et cetera, that population stabilizes, can even decrease to find the right levels of where it's at. We've seen that in Japan, we've seen it in some of the Scandinavian countries. And so to have a steady state population that is within the sustainable carrying capacity of the planet, connected to a post-growth materials economy where the materials that we are using are being designed in a cradle-to-cradle way where their recyclability after this particular use is built right in. There's no such thing as waste. There's just moving the old stuff back into new stuff. The new stuff is being made from old stuff, so it doesn't require virgin resource acquisition. The only new thing coming into the system, and doesn't mean we won't ever take a new thing into the system as far as atoms go. We could. We find an asteroid with some interesting platinum, we could do that. But we have a system that doesn't require trash or extraction, right? That's what post-growth means, is post-necessity for growth, so that it actually can be sustainable, viable, and then we just keep increasing the efficiency of how we utilize those resources and attenuating the forms that they're in. The only resource that we keep bringing into the system continuously is energy, because that's what we keep having ongoing access to. So
this period, so to try and make sense of this period that we're in, and to kind of stay on the overview and not to get lost into too many of the details, so we can actually see how to make sense of this, the meta perspective of this overall perspective. So the first thing is to realize that the current system is collapsing, that it is not able to evolve itself because of its fundamental architecture, evolve itself to support a new sustainable era going forward. So the first thing is to realize that the system is truly collapsing in a massive way. The second concept is that we can build new systems that operate quite differently. The current systems of economics, etc., have founded themselves on an individualistic and mechanistic kind of level. Very complicated machinery of interaction that is always via the machine. In other words, an exchange between and a relationship between me and you is very often through an intermediary of the financial system, of employment, of jobs. and that has been a major driver. So evolving the system into more of a living ecosystem, into an ecology of different industries, and an ecology of relationships, an ecology of agreements. We can look towards nature as in the form of biomimicry, and actually mimic the relationships that are already inherent in nature. So we're not having to reinvent this all from scratch. We actually have the ways of nature as a guideline in which we can restructure our economy.
I am concerned about certain directions that AI could take that would be not good for the future.
In this video series, we're also going to be dealing with artificial intelligence. It is an area that needs to be addressed, as it's going to be playing a large role in humanity's future. And it is really a movement, essentially, that artificial intelligence is something that works for the betterment of humankind and the poor elite groups working against a common interest. So if it goes totalitarian, then we're looking at AI serving private secret interests. If it goes democratized, then we're looking at what an individual's how an individual's life is transformed through collective intelligence and artificial intelligence being one and the same thing. This chapter is on the breakdown of our various systems, mainly the economic system. I'm going to have a quick look at what are the different systems that are breaking down and how they're breaking down. And it's not only the systems of money and education and political systems that are breaking down, but it's actually the way that we see the world, and our very scientific, individualistic way of seeing the world is also breaking down.
When we talk about collapse, we often think of it as like this category of negativity, when we actually can see it as an integral part of many kinds of system pattern changes. There's a collapse of some previous mode or structure, which actually is what enables the new mode or structure to form. And the collapse in that sense is good relative to what is emerging. And in some cases, it's absolutely necessary. And so I think there's a really important opportunity here to bring this aspect of the collapse conversation in. And maybe a historic place we could do it is in quantum mechanics with the collapse of the wave function, where collapse isn't bad at all. It's just called measurement. And so I think it's an interesting way of remembering that the word has a really strong stigma associated with it, but it needn't necessarily, although clearly there are some people that use it in really depressing ways.
For this section on collapse, I'm going to be looking at different areas of collapse. We've got systems that are breaking down. Firstly, our medical system that impacts the economic system, that impacts our communication systems, business systems, supply chains. So we've got quite a big systemic breakdown. We also have a breakdown of our culture and what we believe in, a breakdown of us versus them, and we start to see that we're all in this fish tank together, and the breakdown of who we are as individuals in our culture. Then we also have a breakdown and a collapse of self. Who am I? And what does it mean to be an individual in a whole system, in a new ecology? We can't look at ourselves the same way, so we have to try and develop new cells that are healthy in this new ecology. And so looking at our identity and how to build a resilient, healthy self system. We're going to be looking at the self, and then how are our actions then different in the world? So how do we spend our time differently? How do we interact differently? How do we spend money, spend time, spend our energy differently? Where do our actions go to? And how do we make sense of the world so that we can take action accordingly? So it's a whole collapse of these different areas and a rebuilding in. I just want to add in here that the severity of this collapse is largely unnoticed. I don't think there are very many people who are aware that this is no minor collapse. It really makes the 2008 financial collapse look like a drop in the ocean. It is actually inconceivable that any economist or politician in their right mind can actually think that they can get things running again without a major revamp of the actual architecture of the financial, political, every system possible, which I don't think is possible with the current leadership. In fact, I'm pretty sure it's not possible, as they represent the old system and need to protect it as much as they can. So they are not the people that we need to ask to change. It is really up to us as creatives to come up with alternative systems, platforms, and ways of being as an ecology of an alternative to replace what is a very obvious collapse of normal.
When we think about running an economy that requires year-over-year growth, requires it, because you're fractionalizing the monetary supply, even deeper than that, just interest, where the monetary supply has to fundamentally expand, right? Then to not debase the currency, you have to increase the total amount of goods and services. Services sit on top of product economies, which relate to a linear materials economy, product materials economy, which the linear materials economy means extracting resources from the planet unrenewably, which means devastation of ecosystems and things like that, and then turning them into trash in ways that usually consume a good bit of energy from dirty sources, create a lot of pollution and externalize harm to people and environments along the way, and then end with waste. So that kind of exponential growth economy and attached to a linear materials economy just doesn't work ongoingly on a finite planet.
Yeah, you talked about this drive back to the status quo, and they're going to be very, very powerful actors on that side trying to kind of patch up the existing system. We're talking probably like mass government bailouts, probably dwarfing kind of the 2008 system. So with those really powerful actors on that side, what is the alternative to the new normal? Like you're saying that it would be great if the complexity thinkers and the systems change people were involved. What does that look like? What does a different system look like?
I think that the better question is, what does it feel like?
Nora Bateson puts it a different way in form of a question, saying, not what does the future system look like, but what does it feel like? It's a little bit of a process of like a reverse engineering. I think if we leave it up to the current leadership, they will try and keep the systems going because they are the heads of that system. It is really up to us as individuals, as systems thinkers, as futurists, and as creatives to come up with what that future could possibly feel like and reverse engineer it. Is it a more dystopian future like that is being kind of portrayed? Or could we create a future where we are truly much more interconnected, responsible people in relationship to one another that actually feels from the inside the way it should do, the way Charles Eisenstein said quite clearly, it doesn't have to be this way. We can still, and there still is a chance to create it in alignment with the laws of nature, which seem quite obvious if you look at how an ecosystem works versus a machine, Or we could also look at it in terms of a dynamic interplay of relationships that feel good, that is meaningful and true to our being.
Is that more people are recognizing interdependencies, or what Fritjof Capra calls the state of interbeing, the recognition that my existence depends on the existence of others.
Kind of thinking applied to coronavirus as is applied to, immigration or terrorism or crime. How do we keep ourselves safe from these bad guys? That pattern of thought needs to be interrupted. We need to take a pause, and we're being offered that. Not that the pause is magically going to change things, but that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying let's take in the full spectrum of information. Let's see what happens when the unconscious is brought into visibility, into consciousness.
Yeah, I guess sort of following that thread, my concern, I spoke to Joe Brewer the other day, who has kind of got a name for himself as he's a complexity theorist and looks at cognitive science and cultural evolution. And he said, we know that the kind of more Machiavellian, maybe the people trying to defend the old regime, the more sort of sociopathic tendencies will be activating right now. They will be kind of looking at how they, like disaster capitalism, Naomi Klein's idea that we know they will be doing stuff. How do we, and people who are writing books like A Better World, Our Hearts Know If Possible, how do we compete with those people, with the knowing that there are kind of really ruthless people out there looking for control of the situation? That there is a concern there, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. And so what I look at is what are the ground conditions that allow those people to even prey on the rest of us? What makes the totalitarian response to coronavirus so compelling that people go along with it? What makes the war on germs so compelling? Like, because these psychopaths in power, they don't have, it's not like they're superhuman. It's not like they have a mind control ray necessarily. Their power comes because everyone goes along with it. That's where I get down to the governing stories of our civilization. The story of separation, the story of ascent, that human destiny is to rise above nature, the story of the separate self, the story of control that comes from that. Like, once you accept all of these basic things, then malignant powers can leverage those. They can leverage the fear. They can leverage they can play divide and conquer. If you are so that's a good example. If you are predisposed to diagnose a problem as being caused by a bad guy, by an enemy, then a manipulative leader can come and say, "Here's the problem. It's those enemies, and this is war, and so you're going to have to make some sacrifices to keep the bad guys out." And that's what Göring said at Nuremberg. That it's easy to get the population to go along. Just proclaim that there's an enemy and that they're at the gates, and that if you don't go along with it, you're a traitor. And this is standard operating procedure, and we have in our civilizational myths and narratives fertile ground for such manipulations to take root. And the antidote to that is solidarity. The antidote to that is a new story, a story of interconnection and interbeing that says, is it really an enemy? Or let's question that. How am I part of the enemy? How am I part of the conditions that breed terrorism or immigration or crime? How is everything connected? How am I part of a viral infection? Like I mentioned in the article, terrain theory, which can be summarized by the meme that I saw. Your fish is sick. Germ theory, isolate the fish. Terrain theory, clean the tank. So we have a very dirty tank here. We have, like, why are people so susceptible to this? If you look at the fatality statistics, it's obvious. Almost everybody who died from this had serious pre-existing conditions. So that's part of the dirty tank. Why are there so many diabetic people? Why are there so many people with high blood pressure? In Italy, in the statistics I saw, 75% of those who died had high blood pressure. 35% were diabetic. 30% had ischemia. So yeah. Just to answer your question, rather than to fight the evil Illuminati and psychopaths and disaster capitalists, I'm not saying we shouldn't fight them, but let me say, in addition to fighting them, we have to change the battlefield on which we're fighting that dooms us to one defeat after another after another. And these ground conditions go layer after layer after layer into the structure of the financial system, for example, based on interest-bearing debt. Like, that already casts us into competition with each other. But down to the bedrock of who do we know ourselves to be? What's real? How does the world work? How does change happen? What's possible? Who am I? What is a good life? What's the purpose of life? The answers that we have been immersed in prime the field for the regime of domination and control that we live in today.
I feel like I need to explain being, because it's not always so obvious. I think the feeling of beingness, is what we are trying to reverse engineer. This, instead of the having mode in the mind and the having, getting, doing mode of the mind, it's another state where one is connected to the heart space, and this being mode is what needs to be reverse engineered in the system. So we're actually looking to revere this felt sense of fullness, this present sense, this interconnected relational sense, and have that as the most important thing, and make sure that that is revered and rewarded as a state or a mode to be preserved and to be upheld by structures and systems that we put in place ourselves.
I certainly am trying to hold both of those pieces, that potentially this could be the beginning of a transition. I think it has to be the beginning of a transition into a different system. But my sense is that that's going to take a long time, and it's going to be incredibly painful and incredibly difficult to get there. And it seems very difficult for, even in myself, I feel this difficulty of holding both of those pieces. It's very difficult to look full in the face like how difficult it will probably be for us to go through the death of the old system. How is it possible to live into and live through that without kind of bypassing it in any way?
I look within and ask, am I really ready for the death of the old system? What part of me, I've spent my life advocating systems change, but there's part of me that doesn't want systems change.
So what I'm proposing for the Renaissance Collective, and what I'm proposing for this film, is actually for a number of people, a number of creatives like myself, to start putting out what that potential new landscape can look like, what that potential for a new world looks like. What systems are we going to incentivize and help build? Systems of self-development, systems of connectivity, of business relationships, agreements on money, agreements on how things work, As I was saying, it can be potentially a very painful process, but if there is something else, that's working, no matter how small, if it's working in small community.
Is this not the time for righteous anger? Like we've basically got a set of authorities that didn't see this coming, that seem to be kind of mishandling it completely. I see a lot of people like Eric Weinstein, for example, calling for heads on spikes. And Daniel wrote also about maybe this is the time for righteous anger, for kind of motivating and taking action to create the new world that we're
I do think, yes, I do think it's time for righteous anger. The trick that the controlling forces of this world have used is that they again and again divert the righteous anger onto a false target and onto false solutions. So yeah, there is a lot of bubbling anger, and there well should be, because we have been, as a collective, we've been betrayed. We could be living in an incredibly beautiful, abundant world right now. There is enough for everybody. There's enough of everything that we need for everybody. But instead, we live in a society of intensifying artificial scarcity, enormous waste, side by side with enormous poverty. 1 million homeless people next to tens of millions of vacant housing units. 1 in 7 children in America going hungry every month, next to 40 or 50% of food being wasted. I mean, I could give many examples of the obscene juxtaposition of overabundance and poverty. So, yeah, we should embrace the anger because it is valid. It points to a violation. But to then say, to offer too hasty a target for that anger risks replicating that pattern of diffusing it by diverting it onto a false target. The people who look like they are the perpetrators, they are functionaries, actually. They are playing a role that's systemically necessary. And if we put their heads on spikes, guess what? New people are going to come and do the same thing that the old people did.
So where should the righteous anger be targeted?
I'm not even sure if targeted is the right way to think about it. The righteous anger ideally will flush out the truth. It should never be satisfied with a false explanation. It should be vigilant. It should say, anytime that it's being offered a channel, it should say, really? Are you sure? Because I'm mad and I want it to change. I don't want to run off in a mob and, find some scapegoats and string them up and not change anything. Like that all of that is a betrayal of the anger, actually. So even the idea of find a target for it, that's part of the trick. That's the diversion. It doesn't mean that things don't need to change. But it asks what needs to change so that the conditions that generated this betrayal and this violation no longer exist. And it could be that the best route to that involves compassion and forgiveness. These are not the opposite of anger. They are the result of the truth that anger can flush to the surface. And this is deep work here. But the anger is what can keep us on point and not be satisfied with sops, with booby prizes.
Can go in with the idea of really looking at money, to me it's the elephant in the room. If we really look at this topic well, we can unpack a lot of interrelated systems of healthcare, of education, you name it. Everything is very closely connected to money. And we all work for money. It's kind of what makes the world go round. But if we look at how money is made up, where it comes from, etc., we really need to look at the core axioms, which make it completely inadequate for the times ahead. We need something much more dynamic than the architecture, the current architecture of money. So I'm just going to look at that core architecture, the building blocks. You've basically got debt and interest, and because of the interest, in order to pay back the interest, which doesn't exist in the debt that's created, you need this continual growth. So that continual growth is completely unsustainable. That is enough of a reason to go, look, this current money model, it's built upon this core axiom, which is not sustainable, cannot be continued into the future. So, but we can add other core fundamental building blocks of the economy which are also not sustainable, like the fact that money is used both as a medium of exchange and also as a way of storing wealth. Now, these two mechanisms work in opposition to one another, creating scarcity at a mass level. So you've got people who have access to financial instruments, money mechanics that suck the growing money towards themselves and make it scarce at where it is most needed, at the level of the community, and especially the poorer communities. And this wealth gap is kind of growing. So these core axioms are already what make it unsustainable. You've also got, coupled onto that, you've got the profit model, and in order for a business to be profitable, they are constantly extracting wealth from goods and services that are created. So you've got tax as well. So tax is also a way of extracting wealth from goods and services that are created by people and people that need these goods and services. So you can see already that the whole finance game of leveraging money and building derivatives from this wealth, it's just a snowballing effect of wealth extraction that just, it's been unsustainable for so long, but going ahead into the future, it's just completely ridiculous. We actually have to largely let go of the way that money is and how it works and reinvent it. But obviously that can't be done overnight and will have to be done in stages. But already, if we can get a mycelial network, a fine membrane going at the community level, something like the community exchange system, and other like type technologies of exchange, we can start replacing money at the lower levels. And it's going to be quite needed quite soon, because we've got the money system already collapsing, and that's going to create shortage at the lower levels where it's most needed, the poorer people who get most affected. So that was the end of part one, which seems slightly depressing because it's really about understanding what's going on and about a collapse of our world. So essentially that isn't, it's hard to really hear that properly without feeling some form of collapse within oneself, some form of death, and some form of a very kind of sad ending of an era. But the second half of this part two is called Regenerate, and it's actually the exciting part about building a new culture, about building new systems, and about building a new way of life, a way of life that feels from the inside much more true and full and meaningful than the world that we are leaving behind.